Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Dr. Arthur Mehrhoff. He is the primary guide for the Missouri Humanities Council through Missouri's German heritage. He is the author of several books, including Explore Missouri's German Heritage, which was published by Missouri Life. He is an original member of the German Heritage Corridor Initiative of Missouri Humanities and has worked as museum educator at both the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis, as well as the academic coordinator for the Museum of Art and Archaeology at the University of Missouri. He has also consulted extensively with communities about heritage tourism and preservation, both in Missouri and Minnesota. Welcome, Dr. Mehrhoff.
Good afternoon, or guten Abend, I guess I could say, but it's a pleasure to be here, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and membership or listeners, I guess. And I think I mentioned my grandmother, my Oma Clara Schraut, who was born in Belleville, Illinois, definitely have a connection to Illinois. But I think hopefully we'll see over the course of this conversation that Missouri and Illinois have a lot more in common than just my grandmother.
There's no question about that. Well, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Corbinian Doppelbock, named after St. Corbinian to honor the founder of the Weihenstephan Monastery. Now, 1,000 years ago, the Bavarian state brewery Weihenstephan was the monastery brewery of the Benedictine monks. The Weihenstephan Monastery Brewery, after 1,000 years, still stands upon Weihenstephan Hill. Now, it's hard to believe that there was a time when there was no beer brewed there. Now, of course, that's going back a very long way, before the birth of Charlemagne, before the Crusades. But today, they use very modern brewing techniques, and Weihenstephan products are available at the Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with the featured brew. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button on your podcast directory. And thank you to all of the listeners, now from 40 countries and hundreds of cities around the United States. And with my Corbinian Doppelbock from Weihenstephan Brewery, one of the oldest breweries in the world, I say to you, cheers. Now, you've studied the impact of German heritage for several years, the impact on American culture. It's often understated, and I think we'll get to some reasons why that is. But in just a few minutes to start off the conversation, how has German traditions and customs added to American life in ways that we really don't see?
Perhaps one of the best ways of exploring that is through food. Some anthropologists say that the key to cultural diversity is food and stomach, and I actually believe that's true. If we look at our foodways, if you will, so-called meat and potatoes diet that we think of in American culture, a lot of that reflects German, or at least a certain kind of regional German cuisine. Certainly that you can find that in Germany, but as Mimi Sheraton, the longtime New York Times consultant, I guess, on German cooking, in her cookbook talked about that some much of American foodways has been absorbed from German culture, whether it's pot roasts or hamburgers, and certainly a lot of the meat things that we absorb, but just the meat and potatoes, the kind of Sunday dinner, apple pie kind of cooking that we typically assume to be American has really strong German roots. To a certain extent, that's a mirror of how German culture and American culture have interrelated. To a great extent, it's been absorbed into the larger cultures that we don't even think about it anymore. We don't even think of where hot dogs or hamburgers come from. There's a map showing America's ethnic heritage in terms of Germans, very heavy throughout the Midwest. And so that Midwestern kind of home cooking that people love to rave about has strong German influences. And obviously, German culture has affected America in more than just foodways, as we'll see. But I think that's a good example of how it's been infused into American culture so that it's almost become invisible.
So Germans have been coming to the United States, well, actually to the American colonies. You can go all the way back to Jamestown. But let's focus on a little bit later when a larger scale German migration came. What was going on in Germany at the time that caused this widespread immigration to the Americas?
I'll focus my attention on the early 19th century because that's the period I've really looked at the most. As you correctly point out, Germans have been coming to America for a long time. 1983 was the tricentennial celebration. German Americans have a long, distinguished place in American history, but the early 19th century, with the Napoleonic Wars really upset the equilibrium in Germany and in Europe in general. The many different little nation states, feudal states that made up what was left of the Holy Roman Empire, the German cultural landscape there, suffered many defeats at the hands of French Revolutionary Army. That in itself was upsetting to a lot of people, but at the same time, the introduction of new ways of administration, revolutionary ideas, set a lot of forces in motion that continued to resonate. A lot of people were uprooted at that time, and also a lot of people, perhaps of the middle and upper classes, looked at these revolutionary ideas and said, why not here? So this sort of revolutionary fervor expanded into Germany in 1830 and again later in 1848. The famous failed revolution of 1848 manifested themselves in political social rebellion. And if you don't win, then you better have a plan B. And plan B had a lot to do with coming to America and other destinations overseas.
So when the Germans come to America, as you mentioned, they concentrate in the Midwest, while other groups like the Irish, they concentrate in the eastern cities. What's the main reason for that?
I don't want to venture too much into Irish immigration history. That's certainly not my bailiwick, but Irish immigration was fueled in large part by terrible economic conditions, especially the Irish potato famine. Irish were often known as human ballast in some of these transatlantic voyages, trying to get to the New World as best they could. And they didn't bring a lot of resources with them. So they kind of landed on the eastern shore and took resources in order to migrate west. People often assume that our westward expansion mentioned was that people fleeing from cities, and certainly some of that occurred, but very often these were people who were upwardly mobile or at least had some resources in order to finance what was sometimes a fairly expensive journey westward. So many of the Germans had been uprooted from traditional village life or perhaps from the rising cities in Germany. So they had something at stake and were interested in perhaps either recreating the life that they had or perhaps starting new businesses or artisan practices in the new world. So I think a little bit of the economic disparity shows up in that. But again, you need somebody like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a great sociologist, could have talked much more about the Irish immigration. But for Germans, I think, as Oscar Handlin, great immigration historian, talked about the uprooted, these were people who had kind of lost a traditional village life, and many of them wanted to go not to a place like Philadelphia or New York, though many of them stayed there, but others wanted to venture west into wilderness, this unsettled land, and hopefully far west, as Missouri was called, perhaps, recreate German village life as best they knew how.
Was there any language barrier where most of the Irish or maybe even some English immigrants could speak and then they could function a little easier in the cities, whereas the Germans, if they went out on their own and had those communities that you're just describing, so is there a language aspect to that or a barrier that caused that as well?
Later, the language becomes a really important cultural factor. There were a lot of organized efforts at German immigration because I think people recognize that you may be better off sticking together with people who share your culture, including language. And so I think that's it's one of the key factors in German immigration patterns. Like you said, the Irish and English immigrants could fit in, albeit with dialectical differences, etc. Germans, you kind of had to think about where you could, if you didn't have the education, if you weren't bilingual or multilingual, can you ply your trade in this place? And so I think it was a factor in trying to stick together as best they can.
So you focused on Missouri a great deal, and of course, in your book, that's an emphasis, the German heritage in Missouri. What were some of the large German communities that you're talking about, and what were some of those communities actually in Missouri?
A brief digression, although it's related. I'm very careful. I don't call myself the author of this publication. I admit to being the author of the publication, but this was very much a collective effort that grew out of Missouri Humanities German Heritage Initiative, and I was part of a symposium series and part of the leadership planning team. But it's a major interpretive effort, and in fact, on the publication, the work of the graphic designers, my editor, I feel uncomfortable almost. I'm proud of the publication, but very much a collective effort. It's like the screen credits at the end of a movie. That's what it reminds me of. But going back to your question, large urban centers, St. Louis was obviously the leading, and in fact, in the 19th century was one of the major American cities. It was in the top 5 population, and certainly in terms of cultural influence, because it was at the nexus of this whole river system in the Midwest that helped feed the nation. And even when railroads came, it was still centrally located, although kind of lost its place to Chicago. But Jefferson City is the city of Jefferson, capital city here in Missouri, also had a sizable German influx, but that the old Munichsburg, as it was called, actually from Münchburg, but that separate municipality was eventually absorbed into the city of Jefferson City, over time. But it still has a major German, cultural flavor to it. In fact, it's one of the revitalizing neighborhoods in Jefferson City. Hermann, Missouri, which was the focus of a major immigration effort by the Philadelphia Immigration Society. Washington, Missouri, although the name celebrates George Washington, it wasn't necessarily founded by Germans, but really gravitated there along the Missouri River. So that has a strong German influence as well. But one of the things I was rather surprised to find was kind of a dichotomy, if you will, between the urban Germans, like those I described, and many of the small towns and villages along the Missouri River who were primarily people of German descent. Some little towns like Westphalia, Missouri, almost entirely German descent, and very often, and pretty much from the same town, same village. So it was a dichotomy, if you will, between those city dwellers and the rural heritage that really showed up in German heritage initiatives and these interpretive efforts. And I think it's instructive that folks in these rural areas have been able to, or were able to hang on to their German heritage much longer. As I mentioned earlier, whether it's sharing the same language or just kind of knowing what to expect from other people. Culture is a shared worldview. It's easier when everybody else, or most everybody else, shares your worldview than when you're coming up against, sometimes even butting heads with people who have a very different worldview, as we're finding out today.
So if we take one of those communities, and I know a lot of people visit Hermann, Missouri, but using that as an example, what kind of economy did they establish? What was the religious diversity? And then I know there was an impact on architecture and art too.
Hermann is a great place to visit. It's widely considered, not just in Missouri, but I remember a famous New Yorker magazine by their travel writer, Barton Ruch, back in the 70s, touting Hermann as one of these great American finds. It's actually kind of built upon that since that time. So it was, as I mentioned, the focal point for a major immigration effort, or emigration, actually. People of German descent in Philadelphia who were experiencing this butting of heads with the surrounding culture, worried about the loss of German language, culture, and especially what was happening to their children, decided that they were going to move further west. They're going to, if you will, sort of isolate themselves as best they could and create a new German community in the far west. That was a major effort back in the 1830s, and it's proven very successful. I can't say that it was, they planned as best they could, but they didn't actually explore the land itself before they went out there. So they used maps, etc., and correspondence and what have you. But when they got out there, they discovered that this land was incredibly hilly. It was bluff country. And so when people got their lots that were allocated to them, they discovered what was called vertical allotment, and people weren't always real happy about that. So the hilly topography made traditional farming, at least in that particular area, challenging, but it also lent itself very well to viticulture and growing of grapes. In the publication I talk a lot about George Hussman, great American viticulturalist, vendor, and his efforts there. He and his father kind of discovered that the traditional grapes that they wanted to grow, the kind of Riesling, Heinlein grapes that everybody associated with the Rhine River Valley, they don't grow well there. It's different land. Terroir, as French would say, it's very different. But Hussman's father pointed out that these wild grapes were growing all over the place, so-called Norton or Silviana grape. And in fact, that has become a staple of at least the Hermann wine industry and many other wine growing areas in Missouri. Wine growing became a major industry, and Hermann was celebrated for its wines, won competitions, if you will, international festivals. Again, starting to listen to the land to see what it would yield rather than trying to superimpose your will upon it. And that's obviously other aspects of commerce. It was a river town, so it was a very viable river city. And later the railroad came, and it continued to build upon that. Hermann just evolved along with the rest of America until World War I and then Prohibition. And that we can talk about later is sort of sounded the death knell for the wine industry there for many decades.
So with the religious differences, I know there were religious disagreements and actual wars in Germany. When the different groups come, different German groups come to the United States, do they form into different communities based on religion, or does it depend on where they're at, as urban as opposed to rural?
Well, I think that's part of it. Usually, you would have just perhaps one dominant religion in smaller villages. In a place like Hermann, you can look at the landscape and very often the tallest building, or at least the most prominently located, sited place, might be the Catholic Church. Beautiful one in Hermann, but there were other, what today is United Church of Christ. Back then, I think evangelisch, Lutheran. There were other denominations as well. Jewish groups had their places of worship. Even freethinkers had a place in some of these communities. That's a big part of German revolutionary tradition. Not necessarily disrespectful to religion, but critical of, or perhaps willing to go its own route. In my hometown of St. Louis, growing up in the near north side, my grade school or church, Zion Lutheran, on 20th and Benton Street, and then we had friends of the Catholic faith, and just down the block, not too far, is beautiful St. Laborious Catholic Church. So in the city, you'd find more diversity of places of worship than I think in the smaller communities, simply because you need a critical mass of people in order to support a place of worship like that. So probably find just one or maybe two Catholic and Lutheran, perhaps other groups that don't necessarily fall into that typology. I mentioned Westphalia Catholic Church there. I believe it's St. Michael dominates the landscape. In fact, that's kind of the image of the city. That's the symbol that for a lot of people represents Westphalia itself. So very often you can just look at the landscape and see the big church, and that will tell you a lot about the people themselves and who's there.
So when the first Germans come, there's an effort to maintain culture, preserve their traditions. As the generations go by, does that change, or leading up to, we'll talk about World War I, but prior to World War I, as the generations go by, are they still trying to maintain those, even the language, traditions, and customs?
I wanted to quickly correct myself. It was St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Westphalia. Up until World War I, there was a strong effort to maintain German identity, and because very often they would have a critical mass, say in urban neighborhoods or in small towns and villages, it was possible to do so primarily, again, through the language, but, the customs, the fest halls, beer halls, wine gardens. So it shows up in the landscape as well. Music, as we point out in the publication, was another, well, it's a form of language, obviously, but music, because it sort of gets into the cells of your body, may actually be more important in terms of helping to perpetuate a culture than just language itself. So whether it's in the built environment or whether it's in the what we call the Alltagskultur, or the everyday culture, unless somebody's directly challenging you, we tend to live out our culture. That's the normal way of life. We think it's the best way, and sometimes even the only way, as long as they were able to maintain a kind of cultural hegemony, a kind of cultural dominance in a community or a neighborhood, let's say. I think they were able to maintain that. But as we saw with the onset of World War I, challenges to language, to culture, very serious indeed.
I'd like to ask a question, since we're talking about culture and tradition, and we're approaching the Christmas season. How did German Christmas traditions affect American holiday customs?
If you like Christmas trees, then you've probably been affected by German festival customs regarding Weihnachtsfest. Anybody who's sang Silent Night knows one way in which it affected American culture, and also the works of Felix Mendelssohn. So music has infused our culture, like hamburgers. It just becomes part of our everyday traditions, or at least you lose that sense of, oh, that's distinctively German, and it just becomes part of our own Alltagskultur, our everyday culture. I honestly recommend that people explore, if you can, and whenever you can, during this crazy period, that the German Museum, Deutsche State Historic Site in Hermann, Missouri, does a wonderful job in depicting those customs and traditions, especially at the time in Weihnachtsfest, the Christmas holidays. All I can say is they devote entire rooms. It's a major community festival that people come from all over to experience. So I'm afraid that trying to explain it in a short period of time doesn't do near enough justice to what's been contributed by German culture to our own Christmas traditions. But I think, music, decorations, anybody who's ever seen Schirrenschnitte, these cutouts in the form of ornaments. Again, it's a great German tradition. You don't really have to look too far. You don't have to scratch the surface too deeply in order to find some German roots to many of our customs.
So when I was a kid, my Uncle Heck owned a building called Turner Hall here in town, and I didn't know what it meant, and they used it as a place for celebrations and wedding receptions, and that's the way it was used when I was growing up in the 1970s. But it harkened back to something else. Who were the Turners?
The name Turner comes from the German word turnen, turn, if you will, recalls the gymnastics origins of the word. And the Turners were a German gymnastic and social organization designed to promote physical fitness, German sociability, but it actually grew out of those Napoleonic Wars that I mentioned way back. Friedrich Jahn, Jahn, Vater Jahn, as he was known, had experienced the losses to the Napoleonic armies and was eager to help, if you will, defend Prussia and Greater Germany from similar fates in the future. So he organized fitness organization, the Turnverein, in order to help cultivate physical discipline, mental discipline, if you will, and promote a sense of national pride. So that Turnverein transferred very easily to the New World environment and became, well, like you experienced, these social centers, but also the germ of physical education in American schools as well. In one of the essays in this publication, I talk about the Turnverein and how they factored prominently actually in American Olympic history. The most incredible experiences, if you will, for Americans in German Olympic history was in the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, that gentleman named George Iser, who was a member of the Concordia Turners, won 6 medals, including 3. But what was really interesting is that George Iser had a wooden leg. He had lost his left leg in a train accident in his youth. That gives you some idea of how formidable the training was at that Turnverein. And they also figured in prominently in the Civil War, in participation by the Germans in the Civil War, because they were also, as being fraternal societies, there was also a variation called the Schutzverein, or Shoot Club, where the German militia trained and emerged very quickly when President Lincoln issued a call for arms. Turnverein factored very prominently in both Civil War and in our Olympic history and physical education. And interestingly enough, anybody who does Pilates also knows about the Turnverein, because many of the exercises that Joseph Pilates, a German immigrant to America, introduced, he probably learned because his father was a gymnastics instructor in Germany. So there's a lot going on there besides just, wedding celebrations and other family events. It has deep roots.
So moving towards World War I, of course, this has definite impact on the German communities. There's an anti-German hysteria that develops. Locally, we see it here. There's a large German community where I'm from. They destroyed publications that were written in German. Some of them predated the printing press. And that hysteria that rose up. What was the impact of that on these vast amount of Germans who are living in the United States?
I remember as a young boy reading stories about American heroes and reading about Lou Gehrig, great Yankees baseball slugger, pride of the Yankees, struck by the section where he and his family were afraid or ashamed of the Gehrig name. Why was that? But then I learned that widespread anti-German sentiment, affected even your name, whether you talked about it with pride or kind of hid it. Certainly, it affected the language. That people were afraid to speak the language, forbidden sometimes to speak or write the language. German language newspapers, which were kind of the lifeblood of many of those communities, either disbanded or because they were not allowed to print just in German, you have to print a translation. Basically, you're printing two newspapers, so many of those newspapers simply went belly up. But it would also affect social relationships, certainly, and suspicion. There's a book called King's Row, which became a movie with Ronald Reagan, no less. And it depicted life by the author as he experienced it in a small Missouri town, and the insults, the slight, the loss of status that went with it, whether it was livelihood or language, your own sense of identity, if you will, of belonging. I think all of those factors emerged as results of this anti-German hysteria.
It's not long after the war. You have Prohibition. And I showed you our brewery tour. We had just a little booklet that we did, and some of those buildings don't exist anymore, but we take people to the locations. It's really cool just to look at the landscape and imagine with the picture in front of you this massive brewery complex that used to be there. You had like 18 breweries locally.
I was very impressed, by the way.
Thank you. But what was the impact of Prohibition? You mentioned Hermann as well, but on the breweries and the wineries and the distilleries.
The impact of Prohibition was entirely negative. I mean, as one of the economic underpinnings of many of those communities, certainly in a place like Hermann, the wine industry, and brewing to a certain extent, were important economic factors. So you're deprived of that. Growing mushrooms is not the same as brewing award-winning wines. And I want to emphasize that Prohibition movement, the Volksrecht, grew very much out of that anti-German sentiment that we talked about earlier, especially in Missouri, where someone like Carrie Nation and the temperance movement were very influential. That a lot of propaganda, if you will, was directed at the Hun, even depicting the Hun trying to destroy American culture with drinking, with beer gardens and wine gardens, etc. So that whole sort of Gemütlichkeit, sociability aspect of German culture was challenged in favor of what temperance leaders called 100% Americanism. Besides the economic impacts, there was an environmental impact as well. In Hermann, for example, his wines and vineyards had been cultivated now for going on a century. If you can't use the grapes, you've got land and you've got grapes growing on them, what are you going to do? Grow grapes? There's not that much demand for grapes. So many of those vineyards that had grown, evolved, and been cultivated for decades were dug up and turned into other uses, and you just don't shift back to, you can't recreate those vineyards. So it took a long time for the wine industry to recover. And breweries is the same way, because many of the brewers had, those were influential people in German American community. So this was also a way, I think, of challenging them, challenging some of their dominance in local cultures, if you will, bringing them down a peg or two. St. Louis, I think, a number of breweries went out of business, and Anheuser-Busch was forced to adapt through near beer or pop beverages. I think there's a connection between Prohibition and, I think, in American life, in American culture, certainly was kind of a lawless time. I think when you try and turn culture upside down on its head just through laws, that doesn't always work very well. But it certainly impacted German American culture in a big way, whether it was environmentally or economically or socially.
And of course, Prohibition ends with Franklin Roosevelt when he's the president. So that's leading up to World War II. And I'm wondering, did the Germans learn anything from World War I? So when World War II approached, they knew there would be some anti-German sentiment, so they handled things differently. Or was that anti-German hysteria just about the same as it was in World War I?
Nativist hysteria was directed primarily at Japan rather than Germans regarding World War II. For obvious reasons, Pearl Harbor was considered a day that will live in infamy. I think Germans in America, certainly in Missouri, had learned to step back and they weren't being that bold about their German heritage. I think people changed their names, didn't use the language, adapted more. And certainly in my family, the Mehrhoffs, the Sickmans, the Hirschhausens, these were GIs that fought for the United States in World War II. And I think partly because people recognized that they were dealing with a different phenomenon in Nazism than in at the time of World War I. German militarism was definitely aggressive, but all the major powers were militaristic and fighting for colonies. So difference, I think, between then and World War II made it pretty clear to everybody that even though there was isolationist sentiment, we have to do something here. We know what side we're on, even if we didn't enter the war until 1940.
There's one incident or circumstance that I remember where the Germans actually used the relationship or that long-standing connection between the two countries with so many German Americans to their advantage. And it was during the Battle of the Bulge. I think it was called Operation Greff. And it was this special operation led by Otto Skorzeny, who was like a quintessential Nazi. And they used English-speaking Germans dressed in American uniforms to go behind lines. Didn't have a major impact, but it showed how at least the Germans recognized there was that long-standing connection between the countries. And in that case, they thought they could take advantage.
I wasn't aware of that one. That's a great, it's a ripping yarn, actually. And I'll have to add it to my own memory bank here.
After the war, and I think of the move to the suburbs, this massive white flight and migration, and these German communities. I think of towns like the town I grew up in, where there was a section in town called Calftown, and that's just predominantly where the Germans had settled. I know there had to be communities throughout the Midwest like that. And so when this suburban movement happens in the 50s, I wonder what it does, or have you encountered how that impacted those types of German communities?
I've encountered it firsthand growing up in North St. Louis. And my section of town was strongly German. These GIs that I talked about, they were willing to get on the bus like everybody else and move to the suburbs because the older parts of town, like this German neighborhood in old North St. Louis, they suffered through the Great Depression and then World War II. You couldn't really build new housing during that time because all the resources were going, one, in depression for survival, and then during World War II for the war effort. So St. Louis, my hometown, had reached like 800,000 in a very small space. So it took a toll on those older neighborhoods. So it wasn't surprising, I don't think, that people wanted to get out from living with grandma and grandpa. And just like today, we're seeing young people moving back in with their parents. Well, in those days, families doubled up, sometimes tripled up, kind of used up the housing stock. So it really did have lighting effect, but it certainly wore out some of those old houses and tenements where near where I live. When with the GI Bill and with a lot of federal housing assistance now available and new interstate highways that would cut through many of the older urban neighborhoods, it became a viable economic alternative to move to the suburbs. And then the same happened in places like Hermann, Missouri. Although perhaps not to the same extent, but growing up, there were suburban areas, subdivisions that emerged on the edges of town. And it was a different lifestyle. And once you start spreading people out, it becomes more difficult for people to congregate, if you will, and maintain some of those old traditions, especially with the rise of mass media and television, for example. A lot of forces sort of undermined ethnic identity and promoted more of a mass society, a mass culture.
So the last few things I got to ask about is if the Germans are one of the largest, maybe the largest immigrant group in American history, going back all the way to Jamestown, I think, why isn't it is celebrated or pronounced as, say, Irish culture or Italian culture?
There are a couple of reasons. One, because, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's true that to a great extent it's been assimilated into the broader American culture so that we don't even notice it. An interesting example, the great German explorer, scientist, Alexander von Humboldt was kind of the rock star of the early 19th century. His explorations affected, oh my gosh, Emerson and Thoreau and John Muir, and helped give rise to modern geography and ecology. Lyceum, people would just crowd to hear him. He affected Darwin, helped to sort of stimulate Darwin's interest in travel exploration and science. Nobody thinks very much about Alexander von Humboldt up until about recently, when he's sort of been rediscovered as a man toward the ecological age, Anthropocene, as it's now called. His name was given to cities, counties, streets. There are Humboldt universities. Nevada was, I believe, either Nevada or Utah, was originally going to be called Humboldt. So his influence sort of dissipated or disappeared or is everywhere. There's a Humboldt current off of South America. It just becomes part of the larger landscape, the larger culture, and you forget about where it came from. But I think, secondly, again, this is not necessarily a view everybody shares, but to me, what happened with the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust, to me, it's like stain that it attaches to Germany and the German people themselves. To their great credit, they've really tried to make sure that it's foregrounded, that you're not going to whitewash something like this, but people don't know what to do with, how could this culture, which created so many incredible educational and cultural innovations and benefits, where did it go off the rails? And so, again, like German heritage prior to, coming up to World War I, it's called into question. I think people still have this sense of German. There's that stain upon it. Some of what Germany has done to try and, if you will, redeem its own heritage, its own history. So hopefully less of a stain, but again, nobody should ever forget that. But I think we also lose something if we don't remember the valuable contributions of von Humboldt or a George Hussman, some of the others that we talk about in this publication.
So the last question I have for you is, could you explain what the Missouri Humanities Council is doing to celebrate and educate the public, which is basically the focus of exploring German heritage? Could you explain some of the things that they're doing and some places that people could go if they are interested in learning more about German heritage?
Definitely recommend that they check the Missouri Humanities website, because this is a major effort, and I wanted to commend Dr. Steve Belko, the executive director, and my colleague Caitlin Yeager, who is the coordinator of heritage programs and has been involved with this for at least 5 years, if not more. And so their commitment to a long-term German heritage initiative, I think, is crucial. It's not just a one-off. Publication is part of an entire program, an entire ensemble of very high quality. Well, I won't speak for myself, but the other activities, the scholarly symposia, oral history gatherings that Caitlin Yeager has been doing, where people are invited to bring their artifacts or old mementos or photographs or whatever, and to share their stories about them. I would imagine that you may have something similar going, but this idea of oral history, of trying to get to the people themselves rather than just, and I'm certainly not denigrating scholarship, but balancing scholarship, if you will, with first-person accounts and music and even family heirlooms, I think helps to make that heritage come alive. It resonates with people. This publication grows out of that effort. It's in a sense a demonstration of interpretation. There's no way that I can describe all of Missouri's German heritage. We have 150 pages here. Well, basically, what we did was, historians sometimes call it post-holing, where you look in depth at key artifacts or events or people in order to help to show the patterns, show the narratives. And I think what you did with your questions hopefully helps listeners to see that narrative or envision that narrative over time. I think it's also important that the interpretation go on locally with local historical societies or museums. I think that's what your listeners can take away from this. Missouri's German heritage is, in some respects, unique to Missouri in its time and place. fact that these Germans were located along counties along the Missouri River in the heart of the northernmost slave states in the Union gave it quite literally an edge that you might not find in other places. Certainly, as I saw through your brewery tours and the other walking tours, you've got an incredible resource, German heritage right there. But it's probably going to tell a different story, engaging both scholars and the general public in interpreting that heritage. I think is perhaps what we can take away from the German Heritage Initiative that Missouri Humanities has 5 years on now. So it made a long-term commitment. And I think that's important. People like to believe like to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves, part of why we like history or value our heritage. Certainly in terms of investing yourself in a program, it's nice to know that it's not just somebody's wild hair, that it's going to be there for a while. Maybe you'll see some results from it.
Thank you, Dr. Mehrhoff.
Well, thank you so much, Hermann, for spending time with me. And I hope that you and your listeners find something of value here. Again, it's, like I said, it's unique to Missouri's German heritage experience. I think in some ways it'll find itself mirrored in your own communities as well.
I'd like to thank my guest today, Dr. Arthur Mehrhoff, for reminding us of the importance of German heritage on American culture. The featured brew was Corbinian Doppelbock from the Bavarian State Brewery, Weihenstephan. Weihenstephan beers are available at the Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. It's from one of the oldest breweries in the entire world. If you like the episode today, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Just click the subscribe button and get new episodes immediately after they are released. Like our Facebook page as well and leave a comment. You can even suggest a featured beer for a future episode if you'd like. We have great shows coming soon, such as discussions about George Washington, the music of the Old Wild West, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Fisherman's Tomb, a true story of the Vatican's secret search for the tomb of St. Peter. The music was provided by the Great Bones Fork, which has new music coming soon, and we're looking forward to that. Thanks again for tuning in, and join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.